The boats. Originating in Persia, this method was particularly gruesome because it turned nature itself into a weapon. The victim would be laid inside a boat with their arms, legs, and heads sticking out, while a second boat was placed on top, trapping them inside. The torturers would then force-feed the person a mixture of milk and honey. Sounds sweet, right? But this concoction caused severe diarrhea, covering the victim in their own filth. Then came the truly horrific part. Left out in the sun, flies, insects, and vermin were attracted to the open wounds where they laid eggs that would hatch inside the body. Over the next several days, the victim would be slowly eaten alive, while maggots infested their decaying flesh. The Brazen Bull, one of ancient Greece's most chilling inventions, was more than just a method of execution. It was a grotesque piece of performance art. Designed by the sculptor Peiros for the tyrant Phalaris, this large, hollow bronze bull was used as an execution device in Sicily. Here's how it worked. The condemned would be placed inside the metal bull, and a fire would be lit beneath it, turning the bull into an oven. As the victim's body heated up, they would begin to scream in agony. But here's where things got especially cruel. The bull was designed so that their screams echoed through a series of pipes and emerged from the bull's mouth, sounding like the bellowing of an enraged animal. Lingchi, often translated as death by 1,000 cuts, was used in imperial China as a particularly slow and humiliating form of execution. The process began with the executioner making small, shallow cuts, starting with the limbs, slicing away pieces of skin and muscle. These incisions were not deep enough to cause immediate death, but enough to cause unimaginable pain. The executioner had to be skilled, ensuring the victim remained conscious for as long as possible. Sometimes, the torture would last for hours, with hundreds of cuts made before the final blow. In some versions of the torture, pieces of flesh were even distributed to the crowd as a form of public entertainment, turning the execution into a community spectacle. Rat torture. Rats are creatures most of us would rather avoid, but in medieval Europe, these animals were turned into instruments of pure terror. The basic idea was simple. A metal cage filled with hungry rats was placed on the victim's abdomen or chest, with a fire lit beneath it. As the cage heated up, the rats became desperate to escape, and with nowhere else to go, they burrowed into the victim's body, clawing, gnawing, and tearing through flesh to escape the heat. This could result in severe internal injuries, excruciating pain, and often death, depending on how long the torture was prolonged. The Pear of Anguish. This metal object, shaped like a pear, was inserted into a bodily orifice, most often the mouth, but also the vagina or rectum, depending on the crime. Once inside, the torturer would turn a screw at the base, causing the pear's prongs to expand outward. As the metal prongs widened, they would tear apart the soft tissue, causing internal bleeding and intense pain. For blasphemers, or those who spoke out against authority, the Pear of Anguish was often used in the mouth, permanently disfiguring the victim, breaking teeth, and tearing the tongue. In the case of sexual offenses, the pear was used rectally or vaginally, delivering not just physical pain but psychological degradation. The Iron Maiden. Shaped like a standing sarcophagus, the Iron Maiden was lined with sharp metal spikes on the inside. The victim would be placed inside, and as the door closed, the spikes would pierce their body, not enough to cause immediate death, but enough to cause excruciating pain. The spikes were strategically placed to avoid hitting vital organs, ensuring a slow death by bleeding and infection. The terrifying part of the Iron Maiden wasn't just the physical pain, but the claustrophobia. Trapped in total darkness, unable to move without driving the spikes deeper, the victim would slowly die in a state of panic and pain, with no hope of escape. The rack. The victim was tied by their wrists and ankles to a wooden frame, and the torturer would slowly turn a wheel, pulling the victim's body in opposite directions. As the tension increased, muscles would tear, joints would dislocate, and eventually, bones would snap. In some cases, the torturer would keep turning until the victim was literally torn in half. The rack was often used as an interrogation tool, with victims confessing to anything just to make the pain stop. The Judas Cradle. The victim, usually stripped naked, was slowly lowered onto the pointed tip of a pyramid-shaped seat. This point would enter the anus or vagina, and the victim's own body weight would do the rest. As they were gradually lowered, the pointed seat would begin to tear the flesh, causing severe internal injuries. But the torture didn't end there. To intensify the suffering, torturers would often add weights to the victim's feet, increasing the pressure and accelerating the tearing process. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, was a public form of execution that combined spectacle with brutality. The condemned was tied to a large wheel, with their arms and legs spread wide. The executioner would then use a heavy iron hammer to methodically smash the victim's limbs, breaking bones and mangling the body. The blows were carefully calculated, enough to shatter the bones, but not to kill the victim outright. After the breaking, the mutilated body would be woven into the wheel's spokes and displayed in a prominent place for days or weeks, allowing animals and the elements to finish the job. Death often came slowly from shock, blood loss, or exposure. Crocodile shears. These shears were designed to look like a crocodile's jaws, lined with sharp, jagged teeth. The device was heated red hot and clamped down on sensitive areas such as fingers, toes, or, most famously, the genitals. As the torturer squeezed, the teeth would tear into the flesh, ripping tendons and crushing bones. This method was brutal and excruciatingly painful, often leaving the victim maimed or mutilated beyond recognition. It was also highly symbolic, used on men accused of trying to assassinate monarchs. The shears symbolized the destruction of masculinity and power. The knee splitter. One of the most brutal instruments used during the Spanish Inquisition. Designed to shatter the bones and joints of the knees, this device consisted of two metal plates lined with spikes. The victim's leg would be placed between the plates, and the torturer would slowly turn a screw, forcing the spikes into the knee. With each turn, the knee joint would be crushed, the bones splintering, and the ligaments tearing apart. The knee splitter was often used to extract confessions, and victims would be left permanently crippled, unable to walk for the rest of their lives, if they survived. The lead sprinkler. This small, handheld device was filled with molten lead, boiling oil, or other scalding liquids. The torturer would use the sprinkler to drip the searing liquid onto the victim's skin, causing deep burns that bubbled and blistered. Sometimes, the molten lead was dropped into the eyes, blinding the victim, or even into the mouth, cooking them from the inside out. This method was often used during the Inquisition to punish heretics and witches, and the burns would leave permanent scars, both physical and psychological. The terror of knowing that each drop could land anywhere, on the face, chest, or eyes, added to the mental torment. Water torture. In Chinese water torture, a victim was restrained while a single drop of water was repeatedly dripped onto their forehead. It sounds harmless, but over time, the incessant dripping could drive a person to the brink of insanity. The sensation of the water hitting the same spot over and over again would become unbearable as the victim's skin grew more sensitive with each drop. Combined with isolation and darkness, this method turned a simple annoyance into an overwhelming, all-consuming horror. Victims could endure this for hours or even days, and while it left no visible scars, the mental damage was profound. The saw torture. Victims were hung upside down, which ensured that they remained conscious for as long as possible while their body was sawed apart. Starting at the groin, the torturer would slowly saw through the body, often working in pairs to prolong the agony. Blood would rush to the victim's head, keeping them alive and aware for most of the process, as the saw sliced through muscle, bone, and organs. The sawing continued until the victim was either dead or cut in half. Used primarily in the Middle Ages, this torture was employed as a punishment for serious crimes like murder or heresy. Boiling. Victims were often stripped naked and suspended by ropes or chains over the boiling liquid. Then came the cruelest part, the process of immersion was often deliberately slow. Instead of plunging the person in all at once, executioners would lower them into the cauldron limb by limb, starting with the feet or hands. The heat would immediately cause the skin to blister and burn, but that was just the beginning. As the flesh cooked, layers of skin would peel away, exposing raw muscle and nerves, sending the victim into unimaginable agony. If oil or tar was used instead of water, the thick liquid would cling to the body, making the burns deeper and more destructive, further prolonging the torment. Flaying. The process started with small incisions, often at the extremities like the fingers or toes. From there, the executioner would slowly peel back the skin, pulling it away from the muscle and bone. The goal was to keep the victim alive for as long as possible while systematically stripping away their flesh. The pain was unimaginable, as the victim's nerve endings were exposed to air and infection. Death from flaying was slow, often taking hours or even days, with blood loss, shock, and infection ultimately claiming the victim's life. This method was used as a form of extreme punishment, often for traitors or enemies of the state.